Meantime, Syria's President Assad now says that signing on to an international ban on chemical weapons will only happen if the U.S. ceases all threats of military action. As we said, that is a non-starter. But my next guest says that's the threat that brought Syria and Russia to the negotiating table in the first place. Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State under U.S. President Bill Clinton. She joins me now from Washington. Secretary Albright, thank you for being with me. Welcome.
Well, it's great to be with you, Christiane.
So a lot of tough talk going around today, including Secretary Kerry saying the U.S. military posture remains in place and that threat was the one that's brought them to the table. You agree with that, don't you?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that one knows is that there is this combination of the threat of the use of force and diplomacy, and they go together. It's something that has worked in previous occasions, and I think that, in my mind, there is no question that the threat of the use of force is what brought this diplomatic venue into place and made President Putin understand that this was something that should concern them in terms of getting his client, President Assad, to in fact give up his weapons, his chemical weapons.
From your personal interactions with Sergei Lavrov, what can Secretary Kerry expect from him during these negotiations? Because both the Russians and, as you've heard, President Assad are saying the Americans have to take this threat of force off the table. What's going to be going on in that meeting that they're in right now?
Well, first of all, they have gotten to know each other, and I think that's very important. There clearly have been a lot of discussions going back and forth since Secretary Kerry took the office. Sergei Lavrov is a very smart man. He was the ambassador at the United Nations the same time I was, and he is a very skilled diplomat and bureaucrat, and they are basically at this stage, I think, laying out their various positions. I thought a very typical kind of exchange took place between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov on that point that you raised about the translation. Very typical of Sergei to say, trust me, and very typical of Secretary Kerry to say, too early.
Well, let me ask you about that because, of course, it's good that they said that. It's good that Secretary Kerry put down that trust but verify kind of marker. But Putin himself, the president, wrote that now famous op-ed that was today in the New York Times. And amongst other things he claimed was that, in fact, it wasn't the Assad regime that used chemical weapons, it was the rebels. He said that we know that, and not only that, we know that they're planning a second attack against Israel. This doesn't sound like the words of someone, a negotiator who's grounded in reality and who actually is willing now to make these tough demands of Assad. What do you make of why he would have written that?
Well, I found the letter fascinating and, frankly, fairly arrogant in terms of lecturing the United States about caring about human rights and equality and a variety of aspects of holding up international norms and international law. I think that what the letter has done, however, is to really have Putin come forward and now take responsibility of trying to get something done about the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that he does now have to move Assad and the Syrians generally. I'd love to know how that phone call is going to take place. But ultimately, and there's a great contradiction, frankly. I mean, he has said that the rebels were the one who used it. He now says that it was used. They now admit that the Syrian government, the regime, should put their weapons under control. And also the Syrian foreign minister, when he was in Moscow, admitted that they were going to put their weapons under control when 24 hours before that they didn't have any. So there are an awful lot of contradictions going on. And this is going to be, Christiane, you know this, a very complicated story and one that we have to follow with great care.
Let me finish by asking you about the immense amount of criticism that is going on in foreign policy circles about the president's handling of all of this. Let me read you something that Michael Gerson wrote in the Washington Post just recently. Talking about a U.S. military strike, something that Putin thought inevitable just a few weeks ago, is off. Russia's Syrian client, Bashar al-Assad, stays in power. The Syrian opposition is effectively hung out to dry. That is the sum total, he says, of what's just happened. I mean, isn't that true?
No, I don't think so. I think that clearly the situation in Syria on the ground is unbelievably complicated. And it's been going on a while, and there is a humanitarian crisis, and we have seen the horror created by the chemical weapons. I think that the president made very clear that the threat of the use of force was on the table. I also think that there had been discussions that were going on, and I think that it would be irresponsible of the president and Secretary Kerry not to explore what this offer has been. We've already seen, in fact, that it's going to be complicated and it's going to take a while. But as Secretary Kerry said, the threat of the use of force and that option is not off the table. And the president, I think, in his speech really explained very well what we had to do. And what I liked about the speech was that he dealt with the questions that people are asking. I had called people on the Hill, and those are the issues that concern them. But I think we have to go back again and just, you asked me about the Putin letter. I really find that part of the story very peculiar, and that Putin should lecture the United States.
And just finally, isn't this bringing Assad into the equation, having to bring him into the equation? Secretary Kerry said this has to happen with his cooperation, legitimizing the very president that Obama has been trying to discredit and say must step down for the last 2.5 years.
Well, I think ultimately it is a reality that, in fact, President Putin heads another country that can play a role in this. There is no question, from what I've read, is that the Russians are very much involved in supporting Assad and his regime, and therefore they might be exactly the people to put pressure on him. But we really, trust but verify, and that this is an avenue that has to be tried in order to stop the horrors that are taking place in Syria. But, Christiane, you know this, the story in Syria started a while back. It's going to go on a while, and I think that what is a good sign of foreign policy management is when you are able to adapt and understand what the changing situation is, and yet maintain your values, which is what President Obama has done by talking about the importance of supporting that international norm that it is barbaric to kill people with poisonous gas and watch those children dying.
Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, thank you so much for joining me.